welcome to everybody joining us in person, on Zoom, on YouTube, with a couple-hour delay. Before we do the Devar Torah this morning, just for a long time in Jewish tradition, the learning of Torah has been seen as not just a metaphor, but as a zechut, as a merit for the healing of all of those in our community. And of course, both the last 3 weeks, nationally and locally, we know many of those, our friends, our brothers and sisters, who are in need of special merit, special healing this week. Before we recite the Devar Torah, if anybody here has additional names of people that are in specific need of any type of refuah this Shabbat, we'll take a second and collect a few. Jerry Seeger? Bigorn. And of course, our learning this morning, yes. Yes, and of course, our learning will be in merit of the healing of all of those who are still in captivity and still in need of healing. So we are in Parsha Lech Lecha this week, so just a global picture of where we're at in the Torah cycle. We started with the creation of the world 2 weeks ago, and the Torah moves fast throughout history. So now we are already in a well-populated world, and we're introduced into a man named Abraham this week, who is going to be our main character for the next several parshiot. And Lech Lecha is one of those Torah portions that has so much to be able to talk about. This is, of course, at the beginning of the Torah portion where God comes to Abraham and says, Lech Lecha, go out of your father's house, leave everything, go on this mission that I'm going to send you. And of course, Abraham travels to the land of Canaan, the land of Israel. And upon reviewing the Parsha earlier this week, I was struck by almost the simplicity and austerity of which Abraham has in terms of traveling to the land of Israel. There's been many times throughout our history, both throughout the rest of the Torah, throughout the Tanakh, throughout both Talmudic and subsequent later medieval journeys to Israel. Of course, we can talk about the modern Zionist movement, and it's never been that simple. And Abraham is seemingly able to pick up and just walk straight across. There's no barrier. There's nothing stopping him. He doesn't confront any armies. There's no war. And I was reading this, and I was almost, again, struck by the simplicity. And then, of course, you get to the 10th verse of this week's Torah portion, Genesis 12:10. And immediately the narrator comes in and says, and immediately after getting to the land, Vayehi Ra'av Ba'aretz, right? There was a famine that broke out in the land, and Abraham had to travel down to Egypt. And all of the simplicity immediately ends, and Abraham is thrusted into what we now know to be the next several parshiot. But like all good stories, and Aiden in a second will project some sources here for our study, like all good stories, there are moments in that story that people tend to focus on more and moments that people tend to focus on less, right? Anybody here who's ever read a book, there are pages that turn easier than other pages. And generally, overly detailed accounts of military and politics are not the stuff that everybody is running to discuss. And so generally, when it comes to Parsha Lech Lecha, we want to discuss the idea of the journey. Perhaps we want to discuss Abraham and Hagar and Sarah and those dynamics. But as I was going through the Parsha this week, I kept coming back to this enigmatic story in Genesis 14. And every time I tried to think, it would be better this Shabbat to talk about another component of the Parsha, I kept coming back to this war that happens that I've probably read through this Torah portion 100 times in my life, and I've never been struck by this as much as it hit me this week. So we'll talk a little bit about this story and where I think it could give us guidance for, obviously right now, we're here 3 weeks after the most horrific thing to happen in the Jewish community over the last 70 years. And hopefully the story can give us some guiding principles and guiding ideas of how we can use our tradition and our Torah to connect us to current events. So all of a sudden, Abraham, just to give the summary, he ends up in Israel. He's forced to go down into Egypt. He has that whole bit with Pharaoh where he lies and tells him that Sarah is his wife, right? That story ends. Abraham eventually travels back up to Israel, and he ends up splitting with his nephew Lot, and all of a sudden, the wider geopolitics of the area get very messy. And so if you are not one who likes long biographical lists of names, I'm sorry for the next 15 seconds, but it'll become clear in a second. This is also, by the way, for anybody that's ever asked to read a section of Torah, hope they don't give you the beginning of Genesis 14, because this is one of the hardest chapters in Torah to read. So Genesis 14 begins when King Amraphel of Shinar, King Arioch of Elasar, King Kladeomar of Elam, King Tidal of Goyim, made war on King Bera of Sodom, King Birsha of Gomorrah, King Sinab of Admah, King Shembar of Zeboim, and King of Bela, which is Zoar. I'm not going to give you a test later, so you do not need to memorize that. All the later joined forces at the valley of Sidim, now the Dead Sea. 12 years they served Kladeomar, and 13 years they rebelled. So just a little big picture of the geopolitics. Kladeomar was the, say, top king in the area. Generally, when we think kings, we're thinking of, say, the king of England, who was the king over a massive geographical area. In biblical times, a king probably meant something more akin to how we would say mayor or regional head, right? These were not very large areas. For those that have been to the land of Israel, to now know that there were 9 kings that were split in between the land of Israel, you can get a sense as to how big these jurisdictions are. But Kladeomar was the sort of head king, and all of these other regional kings served him. For 12 years they served him. In the 13th year, there was a rebellion. Why was there a rebellion? The Torah does not tell us, so one could use their imagination. Perhaps there was a tax dispute. As the rabbis in the Talmud say, perhaps everybody just wanted to increase their governance over the land of Israel, as some other rabbis in the Talmud say. But all of a sudden, in the 14th year, Kladeomar and the kings who were with him came and defeated the Rephaim at Ashterot Karnaim, and the Zuzim at Cham, and the Emim at Sheva Karithim, and the Horites in the hill country of Seir, as far as El Paran, which is by the wilderness. So again, to give the summary version, Kladeomar, the king who was rebelled against, decides that he's not too happy that these other kings were rebelling against him. So he amasses an army. He allies himself with some of the kings that still stayed by his side, and they declared war with all of the other kings that rebelled. On their way back, they came to Ein Mishpat, which is Kadesh, and subdued all of the territory. Aiden, can we get a scrolling down? Perfect. And subdued all of the territory of the Amalekites and also the Amorites who dwelt in Chazazon Tamar. Then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zohar, went forth and engaged them in battle in the valley of Sidim, King Kladeomar of Elam, King Tidal of Goyim, King Amraphel of Shinar, and King Arioch of Elazar, 4 kings against the 5. So this does not seem like the normal stuff of Genesis, by the way. So for those who are sitting there thinking, I have been studying the Torah for 50 years every single week, and I never remember this part, it's because quite literally every time, and I do this too, I open Lech Lecha, you end up skimming by this very quickly, because one of the things that both traditional Jewish scholars note and academics, when they're trying to peel apart and ask questions such as how did the book of Genesis get compiled, everybody thinks this source is a strange source that very much does not jive with the wider flow of Abraham and Genesis, but that'll be important for our conversation. For those who are more geographically inclined, you can see all of these different cities and all of the different routes that the kings went on this map on the right. I won't spend too much time studying it because immediately now we're introduced to Abraham's role in all this. So we scroll down a little bit more, and the Torah tells us the valley of Sidim was dotted with bitumen pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah in their flight threw themselves into it, while the rest escaped to the hill country. The invaders seized all the wealth of Sodom and Gomorrah and all of their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, and his possessions, and departed, for he had settled in Sodom. All of a sudden, a fugitive brought the news to Abram the Hebrew, who was dwelling in the tent of Mamre the Amorite, kinsman of Eshcol and Anier, these being Abraham's allies. And when Abraham heard the news that his kinsman has been captive, he mustered his retainers born into his household, numbering 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. At night, he and his servants deployed against them and defeated them, and he pursued them as far as Chovah, which is north of Damascus. He brought back all the possessions. He also brought back his kinsman Lot and his possessions and the woman and the rest of the people. So Abraham finds out about this regional war. He is there hoping to mind his own business in the tents of Mamre, right smack in the middle of the country of Israel. And all of a sudden, a fugitive runs and brings news to him that Abraham's kinsman, his relative, had been captured. And Abram at this point, he only becomes Abraham towards the end of the Torah portion, he immediately doesn't skip a beat. He convenes an army of 318 men, again, giving you some sense of the sizes of these wider regional areas, and he immediately goes to rescue Lot, and presumably there's happily ever after. And so we peel back a little bit and we try to jog our memory of who is this Lot, how did he end up in Sodom and Gomorrah, why would Abraham risk everything to save him? And we get quite an interesting story that takes place one chapter earlier in our Torah portion. I won't actually read it, but I'll summarize it. But for those who want to read the exact details, you're welcome to read Genesis 13. Abraham and Lot, upon getting to the land of Israel, all of a sudden realize that they have a problem because they are both shepherds and they both have large flocks. And according to at least the rabbinic commentary on this, everywhere Abraham is going, he wants to make sure that his flocks are only eating, shall we say, ethically sourced grass. And what he means by that is if Will owns a field, it is probably not a very moral thing for me to do than to take all of my flock to his field and eat all of the grass and all of the other food. And so we're told that as Abraham was going through the land of Israel, he was being very careful with exactly where his flock was grazing. And all of a sudden, Lot, with his farmers and his shepherds, they were just going wherever, and they were eating the grass of everything. And this, of course, sparked a nice Jewish debate, which turned into a rivalry between family members. This is not the first and not the last familial rivalry in the book of Genesis. And Lot decides to go his separate way. He surveys the land. He sees a nice town of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he descends there. And so the last time Abraham saw his nephew was actually not a time of, oh, have a wonderful trip to Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Whenever you want to come visit, we'll be sitting here waiting in the north of Israel waiting for you, right? This was a fight that pulled apart a family. And yet you see Abraham immediately rise to the occasion. And so, of course, the rabbis in the medieval period try to fill in a little bit of the gaps. And if you notice on the story above, I won't make Aiden scroll all the way back up, but I highlighted some words in yellow to almost act as hyperlinks for the rabbis of pointing out there are some weird components to this story. And so, first of all, this Forno, probably the most important Italian rabbi of the Middle Ages, tries to give us a little bit of the economic or political background as to what's happening. And he says, why does the Torah specify the fact that they took Lot? And so he says they made a special effort to capture Lot because he was Abraham's nephew. They were aware of Abraham's wealth, and they were expecting that Abraham would pay a heavy ransom for the release of his nephew. And so specifically, Claude Omar at some point was not just worried about this wider regional and political battle that was happening against these 5 kings who rebelled. He was also interested in enriching himself along the way, right? If I could just capture this one extra person, even though Lot had no personal vested stake in this entire regional war, I might as well because I can get a nice ransom. And Rashi, of course, the French sage, fills us in on the detail of this fugitive that comes and tells Abraham. And Rashi tells us this fugitive is none other than a man named Og, who is referred to in both Genesis 5 and Deuteronomy 3. And going to the second paragraph, Og's intention in telling Abraham that his nephew had been captured was not some altruistic motive on behalf of him, but we know Sarah was quite the beautiful woman, because the story right before this was a story of Pharaoh trying to take Sarah for himself. And so Pharaoh wasn't the only buddy who apparently had eyes on Sarah. Og, this fugitive, went to Abraham saying they captured Lot, hoping to draw Abraham into a war, because if Abraham was away at war, perhaps Og would be able to take his wife. So we get a wider geo-regional conflict. And what's interesting about this story, and this is where I'll place some values and then I'll problematize it in a second. This is really the first time we see Abraham taking real initiative in anything. I mean, for the first couple of chapters of Abraham's existence, he's oftentimes a much more passive character. God is telling him to go to a new land. Pharaoh is telling him what he should do when he's in the land of Pharaoh. His wife is telling him what he should do as he is dealing with the politics of trying to pretend that he's his sister, right? Abraham almost exists as not necessarily a prime force or a prime mover. Until Genesis 14, we see Abraham realizing that there's a problem and actually stepping up to solve it. And it turns out that where Abraham acts here is, of course, in an act of militance and an act of violence. And I think this week's Torah portion is interesting because at least at first glance, and I think that this is an important thing to say, Jewish values are not always universally against the use of violence and force in times of important self-defense. And especially when there are kinsmen, especially when there are brothers that are at foot, that are in play, that are at risk, the Jewish value is not to say, let's just ask a little bit harder for a ceasefire, let's just pray a little bit more, let's just hope that everything works out. And Joseph Soloveitchik in his book, Kol Dodi Dofek, again, we don't have to read the whole source, but if you scroll down a little bit more, he points out that actually the first action, not just of Abraham, but of another Jewish character, Moses, who we're only introduced to in the book of Exodus, his first act also was an act of violence in order to save somebody, right? We all recall the story of the Egyptian taskmaster who is beating the Hebrew slave. And the first time we see Moses do anything as a grown-up after he wakes up in Pharaoh's castle and all of a sudden realizes that there's oppression going on, is we see Moses also acting. But there's a couple details of the story that I think are also important to keep in mind. And the story never ends there, right? The Torah is always more complicated than just a singular value or singular idea. So we scroll down a little bit more, and we do a good amount more. There we go. Perfect. So we note that the Torah is seemingly a little bit clunky. And just to remind us, I won't make Aiden scroll back 3 pages up, but at the end of the story, after Abraham rescues Lot, the story goes a little bit on and says that Abraham chased down Klada Omar, and the words are, until Dan, until Chova. Now, I'm not an English professor, but I would imagine if somebody turned in a high school or college essay, and they said, somebody ran and chased somebody until Dan, until Chova, right? That would be underlined and highlighted. Why are you using the double language, right? Generally, you should just say until Dan and Chova, maybe until Dan and then Chova, right? It's strange language. And plus, for those who are familiar with the map of Israel, Dan is smack in the middle of the north of Israel. For those who have had the blessing of traveling to the land of Israel, you can still go today to a place called Tel Dan. It's a fascinating archaeology site for reasons that'll be clear in about 45 seconds. But there's another problem here that our sources highlight, which is this is a biblical anachronism. What do I mean by that? Dan was Abraham's great-grandson. He was one of the 12 sons of Jacob. The tribe of Dan did not exist yet. The tribe of Dan was based off of a person that didn't exist. And so this sentence is a major question mark for all biblical commentary saying, what are you talking about until Dan? That's as if you're talking to somebody from before 1776 and you say, from the country of America, right? Something that didn't happen yet. And so Rashi tries to fill us in the details. And Rashi says, perhaps when Abraham chases him until Dan, there's actually much more of a symbolic reading going on here. So here's what Rashi tells us. There, Abraham's strength failed him. So the entire time Abraham was in the south and middle of the land of Israel, God was with him. His strength was strong. The second he gets to the north, to this place called Dan, all of a sudden his strength was sapped, for he saw prophetically that at some time in the future, his descendants would there erect a golden calf. Rashi continues and says, what is Chova, right? Why is the Torah saying until Dan, until Chova? Rashi tells us there is no place bearing the name Chova. So all of you who had your maps out that were trying to follow all of these regional places by pointing to places on the map. Rashi tells you, don't waste your time. There's no actual place called Chova, but the city of Dan is called Chova. Chova in Hebrew comes from the word chiyuv or chayev, which means to be obligated or to be guilty in some way on account of the idolatry which would once be practiced there. So we're sitting here saying, that's all nice and well. What is this idolatry that Rashi is talking about? So we look to the book of Kings, which we never actually read publicly in the Jewish community, so oftentimes the more subtle details are lost. But we get this fascinating story that most people are shocked when they hear about Jeroboam, who was one of Solomon's sons, who, shall we say, became a little bit wayward and led to the splitting between the north and south of Israel. And Jeroboam said as follows. So Jeroboam, again, is splitting off from the southern Judah, from the temple, and says as follows. Now the kingdom may well return to the house of David. If these people still go up to offer sacrifices at the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, the heart of these people will turn back to their master, King Rehoboam, who was the other king of Judah. They will kill me and go back to King Rehoboam of Judah. So he says, if I don't do something, people are going to still go back down to Jerusalem to pray. So what does he do? So the king took counsel, right? I'm in verse 28, and made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, you have been going up to Jerusalem long enough. This is your God, O Israel, who brought you from the land of Egypt. He set up one in Bethel, in Beit El, and placed the other in Dan. That proved to be a cause of guilt, for the people went to worship at the one in Dan. So what Jeroboam does in the 9th century BCE is he places a new temple in the north of Israel. Again, anybody here who has the opportunity to travel, you can still see the archaeological ruins of this temple that he set up, one of the most fascinating archaeological sites in Israel. But he sets up these golden calves. And it's these golden calves that Abraham, upon chasing after these warring kings, sees, and all of a sudden he's stopped by something. And so we get to our second value, that Abraham understood the fundamental importance sometimes of using force, of violence, and he also there was a line for him. And this line for Abraham was not a line actually of how much force to use, of how much violence to use. The line for Abraham was actually an internal theological line. It was the second you stop focusing on the wider ideas and the wider truth of what you're doing, and the second this for you becomes about idolatry, the second this becomes about worshiping something that is not an ultimate value, this is where we actually now need to stop. And the rabbis pick up on this. The story continues, and so just to give one last part of the story, in Genesis 14. So Abraham returns from this war. Again, he returns from Dan, and all of a sudden, the other kings come out to meet him in what is called the Valley of Sheva. Again, the rabbis in their linguistic genius note that the word in Hebrew Sheva or Shavui means unanimous or in agreement. And so Rashi tells us, well, what happened after Abraham came down from this war? All of these other kings who just led this revolt to overthrow the head honcho king turned to Abraham, and Rashi tells us they unanimously agreed in appointing Abraham as prince and leader over him. So all of a sudden they want to bestow Abraham as king, and we scroll down a little bit more. And Abraham, of course, immediately says, thank you, but no thank you, right? And Rashi actually goes on to describe Abraham says, there already is a king over you. God is the ultimate king. And if you understand that, if you understand the fundamental value that all life is important, that all humans are created in the image of God, then you actually don't need me to be a king over you, right? Don't look at me for your values and for where you need to go, but you should be looking upwards. You should be looking at God. And the people say back to Abraham, okay, even if you won't be king, at least, and now I'm continuing in Genesis, then the king of Sodom said to Abraham, fine, you give me the persons, right? Give me all the captives and take all the possessions to yourself, right? Take all the spoils of war, all the things we were able to capture. And Abraham says, I swear to Adonai, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, I will not take so much of a thread or a sandal strap of what is yours. Abraham says, the war is important. There is importance in me joining this war. But the second it becomes about me and not the foundational values of which we stand for, that is when we are stepping into dangerous territories. And so all of this, right, you might think the next story here is a summary in the story, but in Genesis 15, we get a line that we repeat every single day during our Shacharit service, where God comes to Abraham at the end and says, sometime later, the word of Adonai came to Abraham in a vision, fear not, Abraham, I am a shield to you, Magen Abraham, right? This word Magen Abraham, we of course say in the Shemona Esrei, the Amidah, of course the IDF, right? Tzeva Haganah Yisrael, right, is based off of this word Magen, right? Magen meaning shield and protector, the Haganah meaning the protection force. And so God comes to Abraham and says, because of both of these, right, you did two things that I'm happy with. You weren't afraid to use force when it was necessary. And also, you didn't lose your integrity. You didn't make this about you. And the Kabbalists actually go one step further, and with this we'll finish. And the Kabbalists point out that the name of our Torah portion is Lach Lecha, Lamed Chaf, Lamed Chaf. And the Kabbalists are very fond of gematria, right, the numerical value of every word. And they point out that a Lamed in Hebrew is 30, a Chaf in Hebrew is 20. And so Lach Lecha, 30, 20, 30, 20, which adds up, of course, to 100. And the Kabbalists tell us that there are times in Judaism that we are very fond of splitting 50-50, right? We, of course, know Judaism is fond of discussion, fond of debate, and sometimes we're content with just a single lach, right? And lach means going, right? And so in our goings around the world, generally the Kabbalists are saying we're supposed to be 50. What does that mean? If I, in my going, pass somebody else in their going, and we have different values, perhaps different worldviews, generally our disposition should be, let's try to compromise, right? Let's split the difference. I'll have my going 50, you have your going 50, and we'll compromise in the middle. But the Kabbalists say there are times in life where you're not allowed to compromise. And those times are lech lecha. Those times are where there's a double lech, where it adds up to 100%. And those times are both times when our kinsmen, where our brothers are under attack and in captivity. There we're not allowed to give 50%. There we have to be 100% steadfast in the idea that this is not okay, and we will do everything in our power to fight this. And also times where we cannot compromise is when our integrity is on the line, and when we're being asked to make something about us that should be about something much bigger. That is also a time where we're not allowed to compromise. Shabbat Shalom. We rise for the returning of the Torah to the Ark.